What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the terms are deep state. Oh dear.
investors,
Experts, diplomats.
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy
Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics and Media 101. My name is Jeff Browning, and throughout 2021, my friend Justin Higgins and I and our friends have convened hundreds of conversations, sometimes more than once per day, with up to 30,000 live listeners and participants, where anyone can join and talk about issues that are important to them, including with people who hold different views. We're just now starting to release recorded portions of these conversations, and we're grateful to you for joining us. Part of the reason we started this was because we were frustrated with the status of political conversations on social media, where people are reduced to a few lines of text, where the world comes in 35 words at a time on a small screen, and where we can look up almost anything we want in the palm of our hand, but where the truth feels harder than ever to find and to reason over together. Today we're doing a deep dive into how social media came to be this way. We're excited to release a recorded portion of a conversation, interview, and audience Q&A we had with Sheera Frankel and Cecilia Kang. They're two of the world's top experts on how technology impacts society. They've both been nominated for Pulitzer Prizes for their work in this area, and they've spent hundreds of hours with top tech company executives studying how they work, how they run their organizations, and how they make decisions that impact all of us. We got into some heavy questions. How did these social media companies come to be? What are the executives at these companies really like in person? How did they come to design these incredible, addictive platforms that break the ways people receive information and break the ways we all form opinions about, for example, political issues? What do the companies themselves think about how these technologies impact us? Not only in the US, but in other countries where social media has played a role, such as Myanmar, a place where internet access was limited for a long time, and then all of a sudden, Facebook was dropped into the hands of a large portion of the population. Sheera and Cecilia really are world-class experts on all of this. They recently wrote a book called The Ugly Truth based on hundreds of hours they spent researching, analyzing, and directly interviewing senior leadership at Facebook. We talked to them all about it. We had about 17,000 live listeners with great audience questions, and we hope you enjoy it. As always, if you like what you hear, if you want to join us for live discussions almost every day of the week, maybe ask a question of one of our upcoming guests, or if you have suggestions for who you think we should bring on in the future, please go to our website, pm101.club, where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
You've basically both studied and reported on technology and its impacts on society. What kind of motivated you to write this book? And how does this book, which is, tens and hundreds of thousands of words, differ from maybe writing the articles that you are both on the front page of the New York Times for today?
Yeah, as a reporter, when you write articles, one of the biggest frustrations is how much gets left behind in your notebooks. Just color from the room, what people sounded like, rather than just having a quote and then such and such said, what they were wearing, what they were eating, what they did just before the meeting. All that really gives nuance. And, when you are writing 1,200 word articles, which is the length of a basically longer article in the New York Times, you can't get into all that. And so I think Cecilia and I had this experience of writing story after story in the New York Times about Facebook making some kind of mistake and then issuing an apology and having so much in our notebooks left over and feeling like, okay, well, there's a pattern here. And we're touching on it in these stories, but a book could really tie it together. And we can go back to these sources and ask even more questions. And I think we were both sort of hungry to do that.
Okay, Sheera, do you have anything to add, or are you on?
Yeah, I actually don't. I do think that
we felt like we wanted to know more. Also, we wrote a story in November 2018 called Delay, Deny, and Deflect for the New York Times. And it received incredible interest from our readers. And we realized that there was this really voracious hunger to get inside Facebook and to know what was really happening within the company that was not sort of like the sanctioned PR talking points. And so we felt like we kind of got our toe in the door with that story, like maybe even a whole foot, but like we wanted to even know more. Like, I just think that we're both like just very natively curious. But also we felt like there was more that needed to be said. So we just, this sounds, if this sounds right, I feel like we felt like Facebook deserved a book, if you will, because I think that everybody kind of knows about these episodes that Sheera referred to, but I think that we felt like we were in a position to start reporting for this book and to write with some arguments and ideas in a way that connected all the dots so people could see a little bit more persuasively what the trends and the themes were, not just sort of like these one-off things and having difficulty like understanding what the implications were. So I would say like we wanted to do more.
Fantastic. And perfect segue. It's like you knew my questions in advance, Cecilia. Let's get into a major theme in your book, which is basically the problematic and harmful impacts of Facebook came about because of a conscious design and were extremely predictable. How did the underlying architecture of Facebook contribute to the problems we kind of see in society, specifically the spread of mis and disinformation and hate speech? And how did essentially the founders of this company rationalize these risks?
Well, I mean, I think anyone listening to this is a very tech-savvy crowd know Facebook's original motto, move fast and break things. They changed that eventually, but that ethos is still very much pervasive in the company. I mean, we had engineers we interviewed in the last year who told us that fuck it, ship it is still something that's pretty widely said by product managers and by people within the engineering ranks. And so this feeling of urgency, of growth, being paramount is something that comes from the top. It comes from Mark Zuckerberg, who is still incredibly competitive and looking over his shoulder and wanting to make sure that all the new tech startups are not, going to eventually grow beyond Facebook. He still wants Facebook to be the world's largest social media company. When you make that calculus, when you make that decision, there's a lot of decisions that come downwind of that. And, one of them is growing into new markets. I thought for me as a reporter, one of the most compelling chapters of the book was the Myanmar chapter, because it's almost a perfect case study in everything that can go wrong. You launching into a country where there is no existing social media, really. It has no free press, very few civil disobedience groups, civic disobedience groups. The NGOs are incredibly restricted by the military regime. And what happens when Facebook becomes a key source of information for people is very telling. And so I think, launching into that country without a backup plan and really without, I think Facebook itself would say, responsible sort of content moderators in place. They had one Burmese speaker in a country where over 100 languages are spoken. Burmese is just one of those languages. All of those Facebook now reflects on as being problems. But, people that were there at the time said, yeah, I can't explain to you why we didn't foresee that being a problem. I can't explain to you why no one in the room said, hey, Myanmar's a really complicated country that's been under military rule for 30 years. Maybe it's not a great idea for 20% of the country to come online basically through Facebook in 1 year. Like, maybe that's not responsible of us to do. There just wasn't that voice in the room. And actually, I think Cecilia can talk a little bit more about, how Facebook's business model is so dependent on this growth strategy and on keeping you online as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a really important discovery, but also that there are two, this is a really important point that we really want readers to come away with, which is that the design, as you talked about, Justin, the design is actually absolutely creating some of the problems we're seeing today. Like, these are, the cliche, these are features, not bugs. And a big sort of surprise for us is we kind of set out thinking that the book was going to be kind of a Frankenstein story, like the monster that got away from its creator. But in fact, that wasn't the case. Like, it was absolutely decisions that were made, into the business, in the creation of the business model and the creation of technologies that lead us to a lot of the problems that we're today. But just to back up on the business model. So I think that we think about this and we show in the book that the business model is absolutely entwined with the technology decisions. The business model is essentially, it's an ad business, and it's a business that depends on your attention to create and generate data from you, about you, to feed, to give to advertisers, buy ads. And that's where the money comes from. And the attention part is super important. And that's where the technology comes in. So the news feed algorithms, the like button, the groups, all these different things that get you to be engaged, to come back, things that prioritize emotive content that makes you respond to it by liking or doing by pressing an emoji or sharing a piece of content. These are all explicit technological decisions that are absolutely tied to the business model. And we think that's an incredibly important point to explain why the business is so successful and why people keep coming back so much. I mean, it was absolutely a decision that was made early on, and it was only refined and tuned as the company grew.
So I want to hit on what basically both of you said with me and Mara, and for everybody in the audience, not going to go into it. Maybe both of you can go into it a little bit, but there are a lot of political experts, human rights experts that essentially credit, I don't know if credit is the right word, Facebook with essentially using the spread of information, creating the spread of information, this amazing tool that was ultimately kind of culpable for crimes against humanity. I don't want to say it was a genocide, but for everybody in the audience, you had a situation where there was basically ethnic violence and mass killings. So I want to go atrocities, so to speak. So I kind of want to go into, you go into it in the book. How did Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg justify the result that Facebook, or the impact that Facebook had on Miami?
I mean, I'll start by saying that everyone at Facebook that I've spoken to, including their top executives who've been at the company for over a decade, feel awful about what happened in Myanmar. I don't think I've met a single person that works there who's been at the company, as I said, for the last 5 years or so, who doesn't feel a sense of just responsibility and guilt. I'm not going to name him because he's spoken to me anonymously, but one, very senior C-suite executive has said that he's still cries about it at times when he's reminded about Facebook's roles, and he called it their negligence. So I want to be clear that I think Facebook itself feels really responsible. We have a whole chapter in our book where we show people within that country, academics, people who work at NGOs, repeatedly trying to sound the alarm. Some of them are in Myanmar, some of them are here in the United States, and they're repeatedly writing and emailing Facebook and saying, hey, there's a huge problem here. There have been a group of extremist monks who for a long time have been spreading anti-Muslim propaganda, and with the platform Facebook has given them, they're able to reach an immense audience that they were not able to reach before. And the military is contributing to this. I want to be clear that this is only something we discovered as reporters later on. The military in Myanmar was really amplifying that. And so you had this kind of cacophony of voices coming together to amp up hate speech against Muslims in that country, including the Rohingya, which led to real world attacks. I think, the UN has called it a genocide. And so I'm going to quote them in that. And all that time that was happening, Facebook was not thoroughly understanding or heeding what they were being told. When I was reporting on this, one of my most startling moments was Facebook forms a Facebook group for these academics and activists to be able to talk to them directly. They're like, hey, let's gather in a Facebook group. That way you can ping us when you see a problem coming up. And at one point, this academic who's been speaking to them for a very long time, Matthew Sisler, says, hey, a colleague has a father whose photo was taken and published online, which shows him delivering rice. He works in a charity. He's delivering rice to a Rohingya family, and his photo has been posted online with a caption that's like, you're a traitor. How dare you feed, the rats? Horrible things are said in the captions, and he's getting death threats. And so Matthew Sisler writes Facebook and says, hey, this old man is getting death threats. Can you do something about it? And he gets told, and this is like direct communication with people at Facebook. He's like, oh, well, he has to, first they look at it and they're like, there's nothing wrong with this image. We can't take it down. Then they look at it again after he points out that the captions are the problem, not the image. And they say, yeah, the only way we can do anything is if he himself reports it. It's not going to work for you to report it. And he's like, well, this guy's in his 80s. He doesn't have a Facebook account. Like, how do you want him to join Facebook to be harassed more just so he can report this image? Like, it just showed how even a person with really direct access to fairly senior people at Facebook wasn't getting through to them about how bad the problem was.
So moving on to kind of the U.S. politics, we hit on Myanmar. Prior to the 2016 election and continued throughout today, Facebook has faced vociferous accusations of anti-conservative bias. How did Sheryl Sandberg respond to this, and how did her response affect how Facebook dealt with Donald Trump and the aftermath of the 2016 election?
We were surprised at how she actually threw her hands up and did not deal that much directly with a lot of this. What happened was, all of Facebook felt completely shocked, obviously, by the results, and very few people had connections to the Trump campaign. They began to rely very heavily on the head of global policy. His name is Joel Kaplan. He's located here in Washington and used to head the U.S. lobbying operation, and basically still does. And that was the moment when they relied on him. He's a Republican, very heavily on his political judgment, and decision making from then on became, and this is right before the election, and there was a particular moment, in fact, where a lot of decision making at Facebook was put through the filter of politics and what was politically best for Facebook. There was around, I believe it was May 2016, that Republicans were accusing the company of bias because of this story that landed from Gizmodo, and I'll just quickly summarize, that showed that a feature called Trending Topics, that was like, so essentially this curation bar of stories, that it was done by humans and human editors, and that they were explicitly like just suppressing conservative stories and voices there. So anyways, it stoked this backlash among political, conservative pundits, lawmakers, and a lot of finger pointing at Facebook that they are a liberal leaning company and that they were suppressing conservative views. And so Sheryl Sandberg this is out of her depth. She's very, very well-known Democratic supporter and, was, one of the names floated for Treasury Secretary, from what we understand here in Washington, if Clinton were to win. So the point is that at that point, Kaplan really warned that they really had to think about not disrupting or not upsetting any particular party, and the political party in charge obviously became Trump. And so many decisions thereafter went through that calculus, were made through that calculus. And a lot of Mark Zuckerberg's decisions on speech policy were absolutely tied to this concern of political neutrality. And the most important of those was the decision to create a newsworthy standards ads, where essentially there would be no fact checking of political ads nor of politician speech, and that politicians could essentially say almost anything they wanted to, even if they violated speech rules for every other Facebook user. So that was a really important moment. I'm not going to drag on, but that was, and the point is that Joel became much more important, and Mark took on much more decision-making control in the company over the Trump administration.
Politicians deal with this too all the time. Facebook has dealt with a very public reckoning. We can talk about our own U.S. elections. We can talk about the insurrection on January 6th. We did talk about Myanmar. How do executives and employees in Facebook see how these missteps and their public perception of the company affect their ability to recruit the world's very best talent? Because as you know, as you've hit on, Mark's goal is kind of to be the biggest and best. And to be the biggest and best, especially in tech, you need to recruit the best.
So it's interesting, right? On the one hand, it hasn't affected their bottom line. And I just want to, for the founders listening, like some of you may be thinking like, oh, well, Facebook just hit $1 trillion valuation. Like, how bad can any of this be? And it's true. Like Facebook is an incredibly valuable company and they've continued to see month after month growth. But what I would point out, and I think what worries many executives is exactly that question you just asked. Are they still recruiting the best talent? And, it's interesting. We've actually spoken to some people that are recruiters, especially college recruiters, like really young talent that is coming out of Stanford and Harvard and MIT and all these schools that Facebook likes to recruit from. And a lot of them are not ranking Facebook. They're choosing to go elsewhere for a number of reasons. And they saw a huge dip in people wanting to take jobs at Facebook after Cambridge Analytica, the results of the Russian, what happened during the 2016 elections, the Russian influence operations, that becoming public. Again, a huge dip afterwards of recruiters being able to recruit top talent from these universities. But also, interestingly, what recruiters are hearing a lot of is, well, we hear engineers that don't want to go there because they feel like they can't be creative, because they hear from their peers that so much of Facebook's time and attention is spent right now on trying to copy and destroy other products that are out there, whether that's TikTok or Clubhouse, that it's not interesting. Like it doesn't feel cutting edge. They don't want to go there and mimic someone else's product. They want to go somewhere else where they can really be on that cutting edge of something new. And so I think all of that is really working against Facebook. And I think it scares executives at the company.
Your book also details how Silicon Valley leaders have influenced Mark Zuckerberg. How much of the values that motivated Mark Zuckerberg's decision-making process are emblematic of the broader ethos of Silicon Valley? Is this just a Facebook problem, or is this a much broader problem?
That's such a good question. We, from all of our conversations with folks who know those relationships, particularly, the influence that Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen have had in sort of mentoring as well as influencing Mark's just general thinking. It does feel particularly strong. It feels not unique at all to Facebook, this sort of libertarian bent when it comes to views on government regulation and government sort of staying away, and the ideas of liberty when it comes to free expression. That does not feel at all unique to Facebook. And just having lived there when I was, in the aughts, it was such a huge sort of prevalent way of thinking. But I think the difference at Facebook is that Mark's been there for 17 years and he's still essentially the number one person there with so much control over the company. And what he says is the final say on everything. And I mean, we have, we show in the book how even Sheryl Sandberg was supposed to be kind of a countervailing force and kind of be the person who kind of pushes back on maybe his impulses that may not be the most, thought out, or just may not be great for the company. But we show in the book, absolutely has her own limitations too. And she has told people who we talked to, essentially, I serve at the pleasure of Mark. Only one person's decision really matters. I can't push back that hard. We have this one scene where she absolutely is so appalled at, Holocaust, that basically Mark's permission of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic speech existing on Facebook, but she just doesn't know how far she can push. And so I think that what's different is that Mark absolutely has this uniquely Silicon Valley, libertarian bent on his thinking. And we're also seeing him evolve in front of our eyes. Look, all of us have actually seen him go from college and grow up into this 37-year-old man, right? And we're seeing him kind of mature and change his mind when it comes to speech policy and other policies at Facebook. And what's unique though, is that we sort of feel like the unique thing about Facebook is we're all watching him grow and have this very expensive education at the cost of consumers. It's sort of at our cost, as Kara Swisher said. She wrote this great column about this. It's we're all basically paying for the education of Mark Zuckerberg. So that feels different, tied into his own philosophies on speech and other things.
Yeah. And
I want to add, like, I live out here, and Cecilia's obviously spent a ton of time out here. And it's an attitude that is still prevalent among a lot of startups. Like, I still meet young startup founders who are told, like, be like Mark, absolute control of your company, like, grow, grow, grow. Like, that is still something that is so commonly said to people. And it's interesting because I think that there is a business to be learned for what happens when you put yourself at the pinnacle of a company and in a position where you have no oversight. Like, there's a reason why government institutions have oversight. Like, oversight is good. You need someone to tell you when you've messed up and to say, hey, reconsider that decision. Like, that was a bad one. It's not, it's not going the way you think it's going to go. And being for so long in that position of ultimate power, as Cecilia said, like, what happens down the road? Like, who has to pay the cost of your mistakes in your education? And I got asked in an interview a couple of days ago, Cecilia and I both asked, like, what would you ask Mark Zuckerberg? Like, I would ask him, if you could fire yourself for one mistake, what would it be? Like, if you were looking over your own record of mistakes, which one would you choose out as being the worst? Because I think he himself would admit to having made a lot of mistakes. And I wonder if he could look at his own track record objectively. He would say, yeah, actually, if I had been the subordinate in this and made this call, I would no longer be in my job.
You both touched on Myanmar, the genocide largely that many people believe was sparked by Facebook. How do you look at, maybe if you can't answer this from the perspective of Mark Zuckerberg, because that's very, very specific, maybe the ethos of the C-suite executives, how do you think they view, on the whole, the impact that Facebook, their product, which they created very specifically, that we got into with very specific technology practices that will have certain outcomes. How do you think that these executives, or Mark, if possible, ultimately view their impact on our information ecosystem on the whole? Is it good, bad, somewhere in between? Help us understand how they rationalize what they're doing.
I mean, I actually think that in my reporting, I found that a lot of the executives feel like I hate to use this phrase because it's from Martin Luther King Jr., but the arc of history will bend towards, a good judgment on Facebook. Like, I think that they think that connecting the world is inherently a good thing, and that yes, there'll be consequences, but in the end, the good will outweigh the bad. And that was essentially the substance of the memo that Andrew Bosworth, one of the VPs, wrote that was called The Ugly. And that's where our title came from for the book, because that is essentially one of the many sort of paradoxes and dichotomies that Facebook has to contend with. It's just sort of this calculus of what we do in the long run will be good. And I mean, Bosworth essentially said, we believe so strongly that connecting the world is going to be a good thing. I'm paraphrasing that. Yes, there will be deaths. There will be a lot of things that we won't like to see, things that are ugly, but this will be good. And I think what's really important is to understand that, like, I don't think that one thing that we really have thought about a lot, Sheera and myself, is connecting the world, I think, is in itself kind of like this neutral thing, this idea. Like, it's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but that's something you hear so repeatedly. And I don't know necessarily if they have thought about that second piece. Once you connect them, what happens next? Like, connecting the world is good for what, And I think that second piece is so important. And that's what we're contending with as a society and as a world, with all of the things that we're sort of struggling that Facebook has brought for us, which is a lot of COVID misinformation, a lot of organizing of hate groups ahead of the January riots, ahead of, just so many, one thing after another. And I think that second piece is what we really hope that people can pause and reflect on, is like, so that as they connect the world, what are the consequences?
There's actually a quote in your book that says, social media's history is not yet written and its effects are not neutral. So I'm just going to ask this is my last question, a real fine point on this. Do you think that, based on what you said, based on the language in your book, do you think that Facebook and maybe the executives, maybe Mark Zuckerberg, views what they're doing akin to the creation of the printing press? which obviously disseminated information everywhere, the Enlightenment, which threw off censorship and restrictive governments and gave people more access to information. And if they do, are they also not aware that social media is a completely new communications method and can come with it some drastic consequences where connecting people is not necessarily a good thing?
So I don't think they would say the printing press because they're so careful and they're so adamant to say that they're not a media company. So I think they would out of hand reject that. But, so I was talking to a Facebook executive a couple years ago, and it was on background, so I can't name him. But we were having this conversation and he was like, you guys want to compare us to the printing press, and that's not what we are. And I stopped him because I just read a book about the introduction of the aviation industry and sort of the early regulation that had to happen in order to make flying safe for everyone. And I recommended the book to him and I said, look, why don't you compare yourself to this? Because in a lot of countries, you've essentially become a utility. And fine, you don't, printing press, I understand that's difficult for you, even though you obviously have created a platform where a lot of people communicate lots of things and lots of ideas to each other. But, in all these cases, like, rules had to be created to make it safe. It was a new technology, and here I'm talking about both aviation and the printing press. It's a new technology, and you needed new rules in order to be able just to define it and say, like, what are the dangers? What are the risks? It's out there. It's been introduced. It's become part of the fabric of our lives, but we have to make sure it's safe for everybody. And so here's how we make sure it's safe. And it's funny, I got a message like 6 months later from this executive saying he had read the book and really enjoyed it and saw some parallels. And that, obviously the line that Facebook is welcoming of government regulation and wants it. And then I laughed and said, right, I don't think the aviation industry had anywhere near your lobbying operation when regulation was being considered against them. And so I do think it's going to be interesting. I'm kind of taking this in a tangent. Cecilia will pick up on hopefully because she's the expert in DC. But like, it will be interesting to see what kind of regulation eventually gets handed down to Facebook given their lobbying operation.
I mean, I think that they often compare themselves to every major communications platform and tool in history. And they say, look, this is just like, I remember Chris Cox, like listening to him in a speech he's one of the, I forgot what his title is actually. Sheera, what's his title now? He's one of the earliest employees and he was
head of product.
VPs. He's head of product, all product. He just came back recently. Like in 2010, essentially saying like, look, everybody freaked out with all these other communications tools like the phone, caller ID. I think net, everybody would look back and say like, actually, the phone has been good for society. And caller ID did not invade our privacy and did not lead to people like coming in and stealing all of our, the goods inside our homes. And I thought that was actually really interesting to see how they see themselves as yet another platform for communications and communications technology. The big difference, and I think this is so critical, and this is what we really try to hammer away, is that the technology is different in a very, very key way. It's that there's amplification and algorithms that amplify particular kinds of content that is absolutely in a black box, by the way, to the public, is the differentiator. And for Facebook is not like the phone. It's not like broadcast TV. It's not one way. It's, it's one to many, it's not one to many. It's completely like two ways. So it's not like cable TV. It's completely different when it comes to the technology that was created to amplify.
On that note, we are going to go to Ben Hilda first, and then we're going to go to John Gunnison for a question.
Thank you so much, Justin. Thank you, Cecilia and Sheera. So I think my question is, we're talking about how Facebook is saying that they were not the printing press, but how does Facebook view themselves as to what other tech companies will say? So my question is, I feel like with respect to Silicon Valley and now the rest of the world, when other startups are doing their business kind of like design, they will say, I want to be like Facebook. We will be like Facebook. Facebook did it and it worked for them. So like this disregard for kind of like privacy, this disregard for consequences of their actions, and to what feels like me deliberately designing a business that is, that is harmful and just calling it business as usual? Like, what do they see that part of what they're doing? If that question makes sense to you. Thank you.
It's so disappointing to hear that people want to emulate the bad decisions. And there have been some good decisions at Facebook, but that people want to emulate sort of the path of that I think that a lot of people find quite harmful. In Silicon Valley. Okay, so I think there are two things looking forward that, because in terms of accountability, that part of your question, that we try to show in this book, and that currently exists. Two points about accountability that's absolutely in Facebook's favor. Number one, inertia in Washington. Even though right now there is incredible energy around regulating tech companies, especially Facebook and Google, and even breaking them up through antitrust reforms and with like real trust busters right now picked by the Biden administration, it will be really hard to see them do a lot because they're stymied by really old laws that haven't been updated, interpretations of the laws, those laws that are pretty fixed within the courts. So that's number one. And actually, like creating new laws is, if you've watched Washington over the last 10 years, very little gets done just because of gridlock. So there's that. That said, there's a lot of bipartisan, at least talking about like doing this. Number two, Facebook has an enormous and powerful lobbying operation. And I think it's really important. And we show this in the book of how to understand how they built that and how they understood that would be a really key part of their business growth, was to have people in Washington who were very astute about regulatory threats, as well as and people in Washington who could create very key relationships. So like those are two things that are very much in Facebook's favor when it comes to accountability. When they talk about accepting regulation, and every commercial on every platform right now has a Facebook commercial like saying that, the real question is like, what kinds of regulations would really hold Facebook accountable, rein in some of the problematic behavior, what things get to the key problems that we quote experts saying, that must be addressed, the business model and the algorithms. And those are tough. So I'm going to stop there. But yeah, I just think that like accountability is it's a really tough thing. And I think everybody keeps asking me what's going to happen going forward. And I see a couple things in Facebook's favor, even with all of the spotlight being on all this interest in regulating Facebook and other companies.
I want to add just one quick thing, which is that, my favorite email that I've gotten since our book published was from an employee, a fairly senior employee at a different tech company, one of the largest in Silicon Valley, who wrote me to say that he was having everyone on his team read our book because they wanted to learn lessons from it. Like they wanted to figure out what Facebook had done wrong along the way. And they saw a lot of learning moments for themselves. And he admitted, he was like, yeah, I was reading it and I was thinking, oh, I would have probably made that same call myself. But seeing the downwind effects of it, I now understand why that wasn't the right call. And so I've been very heartened as a reporter to hear about other companies. I know Facebook is reading the book as well, obviously, but to hear about other companies trying to take lessons out of how some of these basic notions that have underlied Silicon Valley's sort of core ethos are now being rethought.
We are going to go to Mr. John Gunnison, and then we're going to go to a first-timer on the stage, which we love here, Jennifer Lee. So, John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Justin. Thank you to both of you for being here. One argument that Facebook and other large tech firms have often made when they're advocating for a kind of protective policy from Washington is that they deserve a little bit of protection and deference because they are U.S. companies, they're American companies, and any ground that they cede globally in the global economic landscape might be to competitors that are sometimes even state-owned from rival powers like China. So how should we really think about this? We know that there are large tech firms that are operating in China that are largely state-controlled or state-influenced. And large economies like India and Nigeria have recently taken steps to ban competitive social media platforms. In part, there's a lot of speculation because they're interested in creating their own companies. So how should we think about these potential rivals to American tech firms? Are they better than Facebook, worse than Facebook? Are they very much the same? Are there risks that come from having rivals in the global economy that are state controlled? How should we think about this dynamic? And should we accept the argument from Facebook in this regard?
Well, I mean, I think Facebook has already, I'll let Cecilia, I'm going to give a quick answer and then Cecilia is going to give you a much better one from her view in DC. But, I think that already we've seen a lot of companies, really bend on their core principles in order to try to enter new markets. And we've seen what's happened downwind of that. Again, sorry, I keep using the word downwind here. Not sure why that's a word for me today. When you concede one thing to these governments, within 6 months, there's another thing. And 6 months after that, there's a bigger thing. And it's a very slippery slope. And then ultimately, look at India, look at Indonesia. There's so many countries where anyways, Facebook and other companies have found themselves banned down the line. If they're going to launch homegrown versions of social media, they're going to go ahead and do that one way or another. And you're just buying yourself a year, 2 years, whatever amount of time to launch in that market, and maybe get some users before you have to pull back anyways. And so I think, companies have to take that into account, that it's sort of like what the FBI and intelligence agencies say in terms of, bargaining in a hostage situation or, when kidnappers demand a ransom, which is that it very rarely ends with the first demand being met.
Yeah, I don't actually have a ton more to add. I mean, Facebook is a global company until it doesn't need to be, until it serves its interest to, when in a conversation like they did with Donald Trump in the Oval Office, where they say, actually, we really think that it makes, like, we agree with your policy, former president, on Chinese internet companies because, they're a real threat. So, I mean, they are until they're not. The thing I would say is, like, the intelligence agencies, absolutely, they've come out with tons of reports about their concerns about the equipment makers like Huawei and ZTE and the internet companies themselves. And this is a concern that carried over from the Trump administration, from the Biden administration. I think the companies themselves, though, like, you kind of have to look at their own practices when it comes to how they treat your data and how they treat competition, and assess your own comfort level, beyond how they compare with these Chinese and other companies as well.
Jennifer, over to you.
Yeah. I was curious what the various motivations of the people who participated in the book were, in terms of, like, just being sources, and how you would interpret their motivations and how then you go about using their whatever material they gave you.
Yeah, I love this question because we spend a lot of time thinking about it. So, one of Facebook's talking points in the book when it came out was we spoke to disgruntled ex-employees, or we cherry-picked narratives. And it was sad to hear that, because it was really demeaning of their own employees who spoke to us. And we note in the author's note, the introduction to this book, that we spoke to over 400 people. The vast majority of those people still work at Facebook. This is not an account by people who left the company because they're mad. It's an account very much, most of them, I would say, are people that are still there and want their managers to do better, or saw something happen and feel badly about it, feel guilty about it, and wanted it to come to light. And so, for every scene that you see in the book, we always vet with a minimum, 3 different people who don't talk to each other. So by that, what I mean is, somebody tells me about a meeting. I don't then say to that person, hey, can you give me the phone number of 2 other people who can verify your account? Because I don't know who they're having me speak to. It could be that they call up their buddy and say, hey, dude, tell her the same thing I said, so that she reports this in her book. Like, as reporters, we very much try to find 3 separate people who, we find on our own. We call them up and we say, can you describe to us what happened in a meeting that day? And then if those details sync up with what the first person says, we're like, okay, we're on to something now. Like, 2 separate people have sorry, I'm tired. I didn't have enough coffee. Have given us the same account of that meeting. That's something that we use throughout the book. And I will add, we then fact check the book with Facebook over a period of 3 months. We ran through all the details, every scene, and gave them a respond to everything in the book. And so I think that's important for readers to know. It's not just like one person tells us something and we don't consider their motivations. We don't consider their place in history and time, and we print it in a book. Like, we try to find as many independent accounts to verify whatever that original person said.
Hey, Jennifer, It's Cecilia. I haven't talked to you for so long.
I know.
It's nice to hear you. Hi. Oh my gosh, we're long-time Asian American Journalists Association friends. Sheera explained it really well. I would just say one small thing. I don't think you can underestimate the value of people wanting to just tell their truth. That's just simply it. If they feel like it's important, they want to talk. Oftentimes it's not transactional. Most of the time, almost always, it's not transactional. They get nothing out of it. In fact, they probably put themselves at risk at some point, to some extent.
We always love first-timers on our show here. We will go to Dr. Danish and then Monique, who is a friend of the show and now has helped us bring on a few people, including these two esteemed journalists and authors. Dr. Danish, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Just really enjoying this conversation. And just had a question for both of you, which is kind of taking into account your understanding of how Facebook actually views itself. What do you think their response, not just what they said after Biden's comments about how they're killing people, but more about broadly Vivek Murthy's 22-page report on social media and COVID misinformation. And also just a quick plug. I really enjoyed that article on Joseph Marcola. But anyways, I was going to say that, as you think about Facebook's response to Vivek Murthy's 22-page report on social media and COVID misinformation, do you think that they actually will end up working closely with the Biden administration to address this issue, or will they continue their previous libertarian type stance? I mean, this is it seemed to be a very scathing report, and perhaps with antitrust concerns looming, maybe they're willing to play ball, but would love to get your thoughts and insight.
Yeah, the report's interesting. There were actually two reports that were published yesterday, which I know the White House is looking at right now, which looked more specifically at how Facebook continues to recommend anti-vaccine groups and pages. And for me as a reporter, that's more interesting because that's a more relevant and immediate action item for them to demand of Facebook. And just to back up a little bit and explain, I wrote a story in today's paper about Joseph Mercola, who's listed as one of the top 12 spreaders of COVID misinformation. And Facebook has known about him for years. This particular report that called him out happened months ago. And now the White House has emphasized that report in meetings with Facebook. It's difficult. And one of the things my article seeks to explain is why it's difficult. He doesn't go on the platform and say, do not get vaccines because they'll kill you, right? Like if he did that, he would be banned and Facebook would remove those posts. What he does is very clever and nuanced. He poses questions. He manipulates data. He often links to studies that are highly controversial and dismissed by his peers in the medical industry. And in doing so, he sows a lot of doubt. And he has become, incredibly effective at spreading this and very, very wealthy in selling people on supplements, vitamin supplements, and diet plans that he claims will stop them from getting COVID rather than getting vaccinated. Negotiating what to do about somebody like him is very nuanced and complicated. It requires debating, freedom of speech and the First Amendment, and it probably will require battles in the courts. What isn't complicated is the fact that Facebook still recommends anti-vaccine groups, including his. That is not complicated, right? If tried this a couple of days ago and join a group, I tried joining a group for natural cures for the common cold. The next group recommended to me was an anti-vaccine group. That is a decision made by Facebook's algorithms in terms of what it thinks I'm going to join and what it thinks is going to keep me online on the platform as much as possible, which they've already said that they want to change. The company is already committed to changing this thing and not pushing people into the arms of the anti-vaccine movement. And so I wanted Cecilia to answer a little bit more about the Biden administration because she knows them more intimately than I do. But that to me is a very easy ask of the administration to make.
This is Sunday. It's not like me. Okay. So I'm just like, no, I think the report was incredibly important. The 22-page report by the Surgeon General, it was the first time that that administration had called online misinformation a public health problem, right? So that's huge. And so, the way Facebook responded was pretty extraordinary because they were so defensive, and it was mostly because of Biden's comments saying social media platforms like Facebook are killing people. And he walked back and ultimately. So yes, of course they have to work together. But here's the key problem. Facebook is not tracking or does not have the information that the White House wants, which is prevalence data and on how much misinformation about vaccines exists and how much people are engaging with it and what the reach is like. And that's like so key. I mean, there is, a saying within Facebook, data wins the argument, but they also often choose what kind of data they want to even look for. And in this case, they have not looked for this. Sheera had a great story on this as well. So that's a big problem. I mean, anecdotally, whenever the White House goes out and asks, where are you hearing these crazy stories about vaccines leading to autism, leading to chips being implanted in you, to all these falsehoods, almost always the White House says they hear Americans say they learned that on Facebook. So it is a huge problem in their eyes. So I think until Facebook gets past this sort of defensiveness of I can't believe we're being scapegoated, then I think that the relations are not going to warm up enough. And also Facebook has, is to the point of Mercola, has not completely banned those accounts. I don't know if that's the right decision or not, but essentially the White House and other public health officials say that this group of people who spread 65% of all misinformation about vaccines, they're known as a disinformation dozen, they all exist in one form or another still on Facebook. So Facebook has to, I think, from the White House's perspective, be transparent about what their strikes policy is on these people and what they'll eventually do with them.
So we will go to Monique, and then we will wrap it up and kick it over to you two for last words. Monique, over to you.
Thank you, Cecilia, Sheera. Thanks for doing this. And the book was great. It was a weekend read, so I appreciate that. My question for you guys, and this is on the record, ladies. I just had to say that because it's great for me to say that to you guys. What are there scenes from the book or like on the cutting room floor that didn't make the book that you wish now, looking back, could have been in the book? And then what's next for you guys? I mean, this is a big deal. Like writing a good book on Facebook is a big deal. So I want to know what's next.
Hey, Monique, can I take this first really fast, Sheera? Because we have so much on the cutting room floor. There was a version of this that was like 140,000 words, right? And we ended up with how many words in the end? Just shy of 100,000 words, I think, at the end. We went deep into the Arab Spring. We went deep into so many scenes. Like we have this whole book party that Cheryl had at this mansion at Georgetown, hosted by Don Graham, Valerie Jarrett was there, like Klobuchar. I mean, just it's like we had so much that was there. We had so much about, interactions between Facebook officials and regulators that I think would have been really interesting. A lot of the backroom fighting. It just, I think, against, maybe our judgment, we were told that some of those scenes were dragging too long, but then there's some of that stuff. What else, Sheera, did we cut? There's so much.
So much. I feel like, Cecilia, the FTC scenes stand out in my mind, the book party. And then, if anyone has followed my career as a journalist, that I spent a decade in the Middle East before I moved back home to California to cover tech. And so I think for me, it was especially painful to lose, I think, 2 chapters on the uprisings in the Arab world and Facebook's role and all that. So there's a lot. And I don't know, in terms of what's next, I think it's hard because I think we didn't, we're still enjoying this moment. I imagine that it'll take us a little while to find a topic that we want to write about in book length, the way we have potentially, the way we had with Facebook.
Yeah. And I also would just say that, I think that Facebook is so in the news that we just want to build on the knowledge that we've acquired in creating this book and writing this book and just be out there and, just really grasp the stories and look for more. And I think that's we feel like all of this expertise that we've developed on the company, but also the business model and technology, I think we're still curious. We're still got a lot of curiosity that'll drive us. And Monique, I love that. And On the Record is great.
Well, that is all we have for you today. Again, if you like what you hear, please visit our website, pm101.club, where you can find all of our episodes for free. We have almost 100 on the way, and you can also find information about how to join us live almost every day of the week. We have an upcoming schedule with national journalists, members of Congress, experts, leaders, all coming here so you can hear from them directly in their own words on issues that are important to you, and even ask them questions if you want to. Again, thank you for joining us. This has been Politics and Media 101. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.